Hey, I'm Jim from Digital Anarchy, and in this tutorial we're going to take a look at an extreme example of slow motion flicker and use the Flicker Free plugin from Digital Anarchy to fix it in Resolve. And the first step is to grab Flicker Free and apply it to the footage, which I've already done. And I've gone through some of the presets, and none of the presets work for this, so we're going to go through how to figure out what settings do work and what the process is for that. So if we look, rolling bands preset is the default, and if we look at that, well, first thing, if you're in Resolve, you may need to turn the cache on, and so you can come down to render cache OFX filter, and we can see that the default just doesn't really quite work. It's still flickering, so we need to figure out what does work. And the first step is to come down to the detect motion settings and turn that off. And as we can see, the flicker is gone, but of course it's been replaced by a whole bunch of blurring. Now the trick is to keep the flicker from coming back, but fix the blurring problem. And there's two ways of doing that, either with detect motion, which we've already seen doesn't work, or with motion compensation. So let's turn on motion compensation, and you can see that does work. The flicker is now gone, the blurring is now gone. It's looking pretty good. And so motion compensation is really your friend when you have a lot of motion in the scene, a lot of moving objects like a football and players and all that stuff, right? But if we look at this, the time radius is set to 8. If we look at the original footage, the flicker is kind of happening like every other frame. It's pretty extreme and it's very fast, every other frame. So the time radius may not have to be this high. So let's set this to 3, and voila. The deflickering is gone, the blurring is gone. The great thing about lower time radius is it's gonna render faster. There's less chance of artifacts. If we look at the football itself, between a time radius of 3 and a time radius of 8, the football is a tiny bit sharper because you're not looking at so many frames. What's happening with time radius is, with a setting of 3, it's looking at 3 frames before the current frame and 3 frames after. And the less of frames you have to look at, the faster it's going to be. Now, you might be wondering why you need Flicker Free if Resolve already has a deflicker filter. Well, the Resolve deflicker filter works pretty well, but it doesn't work in a lot of situations. And so you can see using the deflicker tool within Resolve itself doesn't really get rid of the flicker. It's still pretty prominent. And we've tried different settings. Fluoro lights preset is probably what we've tried first, since this is definitely what's happening here. But then we tried the advanced controls to try and get a little bit better, but as you can see, it doesn't quite cut it with this footage. And so if the built-in filter isn't working, you want to fall back to something more powerful. That's Flicker Free. Alright, so let's take a look at a different type of slow motion footage. So this is something where the flicker is happening over a long period of time. The flicker is really taking about 15 to 20 frames, and so you're going to need a longer time radius. And so if we turn on Flicker Free, let's set this back to the default values for rolling bands. And if we play that back now, you can see it gets rid of some of the flicker, but there's still some of that pulsing going on. There's still a little bit of flicker left. And so what we can do is set time radius up to 16. Let's double that value and see what we get. And we can see that the flicker is pretty much completely gone. We just need a little bit longer time radius. Now again, the time radius, that's a lot of frames. We're looking at 16 frames before each frame, and we're looking at 16 frames after each frame. And so if we can get that value down, that would be better. So let's try something a little bit different. We'll set this back to 8, but we'll increase time step to 2. And so what this means is it's going to be looking at every other frame. Instead of every single frame, as we had with time radius set to 16 and time step set to 1, now we're looking at every other frame. So we're looking at 8 frames before and 8 frames after, but every other frame. And so the time range is still exactly the same as when we had time radius set to 16, but instead of looking at every frame, we're looking at every other one. And the advantage is that's going to speed things up. So let's take a look at what that looks like. And again, basically the same render that we had with 16. The flicker is almost completely gone and the footage looks great. So those are some tips on how to use Flicker Free for slow motion footage. deflickering it in Resolve. And we have lots of other great tutorials on digitalanarchy.com, intro tutorials that deep dive into what these settings do if you want more information about it. And of course, if you have footage that you're having trouble deflickering, you're welcome to send a few seconds of it to us and we can give you some recommendations. Just hit us up at sales@digitalanarchy.com. But hopefully this tutorial about deflickering in Resolve has been helpful, and thank you for joining me.